How are you all? I hope all you are fine. So today we will start Unit 12 of MHS6 American Literature, Huckleberry Finn and its narrative. Okay, in my previous video already in Unit 11 I have discussed all the Huckleberry Finn and Mark Twain's life and the Huckleberry Finn writings timing already I have discussed. Then today I will describe Huckleberry Finn and its narrative. So we shall start. So here is the structure, objectives, introduction, some key questions, preliminary information about Huckleberry Finn, sources, composition, time and setting, Mississippi, St. Petersburg, Jackson's Island, narrative structure of American Huckleberry Finn, distinctive features of the narrative, picturesque form, first person eyewitness, voice narrator, the spoken idiom of the narrative, density of narration, modes of presentation, narrative irony, popular element in the narrative, later sum of glossary questions and further readings. Okay, so today we will go to the objectives. So every unit has its own objectives. So we will study what is the objectives of this unit or Huckleberry Finn's narrative. You will get one long question sure shot of Huckleberry Finn. So maybe it can be a narrative technique of Huckleberry Finn. So it is very important chapter in the exam point of view. So this unit has a twofold objective: to give you some preliminary information about the novel, that is its sources, composition, time and setting, and by focusing on the narrative, examine how the narrative technique adopted in the novel contributes to the total meaning of it. So here is the introduction. The study of the narrative has assumed a new importance in recent times. Human beings have always liked to hear or tell stories, but narratives are no longer restricted to prose fiction. The word narrative has emerged as a large-hold all term that includes TV news readers' tough story about, let us say, Kashmir, comics and films, inscriptions on tombstones, even mime. As Roland Barthes says, narratives may be represented in the medium of language, spoken or written, in image, fixed or moving, in gestures or a combination of this. Further, narrative is present in myth, legend, fable, tale, novella, epic, history, tragedy, drama, comedy, mime and painting. Stained glass, windows, cinema, comics, new items, conversation. In other words, narratives are ubiquitous, surrounding us on all sides. To use Barthes' words again, narrative is international, transhistorical, transcultural. It is simply there, like life itself. No wonder narratives are now considered central to human culture. Explaining the primacy of narrative, Jonathan Culler says that stories are the main way we make sense of things, whether in thinking of our lives as a progression leading somewhere or in telling ourselves what is happening in the world. So, explaining the primacy of narrative, Jonathan Culler says the stories are the main way we make sense of things, whether in thinking of our lives as a progression leading somewhere or in telling ourselves what is happening in the world. It is in recognition of the important part that narrative plays in human life that a whole new branch of knowledge has grown around narrative and narration, called narratology. So here it is the main key point, like you can note down in your notebook of Jonathan Culler. Okay, so here it is the main key point. Jonathan Culler says the stories are the main way we make sense of things, whether in thinking of our lives as a progression leading somewhere or telling sorry. Here it is Jonathan Kuehler. Jonathan Kuehler says that the stories are the main way we make sense of things, whether in thinking of our lives as a progression in leading somewhere or in telling ourselves what is happening in the world. Okay, so it is in the recognition of the important part that narrative plays in human life that a whole new branch of knowledge has grown around narrative and narration called narratology. So what do you mean by narratology? It is in the recognition of important part that narrative plays in human life as a whole, and a branch of knowledge has grown around narrative and narration called narratology. Apart from Jonathan Kuehler and Roland Barthes, some of the names connected with theories on the subject are Bakhtin, Northrop Frye, A.J. Grimetz, Robert Kellogg and Robert Scholes. In case you feel interested, you could, as a first step, dip into recent theories of narrative by Wallace Martin, Cornell University Press, 1986, and some other books suggested in the section in further readings. It is important for you to realize that our study of narrative in Huckleberry Finn will need to take into account all the factors that influenced the telling of the tale. So, some key questions. While approaching the issue of narrative, I would like you to recall the novels you have read as part of your course or otherwise and ask the following questions. Who is the narrator in each one of them? Is the author and the narrator the same person, or are they different? Is the story told in the first person or third person? What advantages do you see in the writer's choice of the narrator? Ask these questions regarding Huckleberry Finn also as you read the novel. So here it is the preliminary information about Huckleberry Finn. So what are the types of sources of preliminary information about Huckleberry Finn? We will study. Some characters and episodes in Huckleberry Finn have been traced to their sources in books that Mark Twain had apparently read and in his childhood experiences. For instance, Jim's original was a middle-aged slave, Uncle Dan by name, who lived in Sam's uncle farm in Florida, Missouri, where Sam spent a great deal of his time. The most memorable servant of the querulous Sam's uncle's family was a middle-aged Uncle Dan, sensible, honest, patient, the children's comrade in adventure, their advisor and ally in time of trouble. It was on the farm that I got my strong liking for his race, wrote Mark, and my appreciation of certain of its fine qualities. Dixon Vector, page number 271. Hawk himself was drawn from a childhood friend of his, Tom Blankenship. Like Huck Finn, Tom was ill-fed, an outrageous wreck of rags, dirty, ignorant, cheerful, carefree and altogether enviable, being the only really independent person, boy or man in the community. The woods and the waters around Hannibal were his education. Living by his weight, suspicious of every attempt to civilize him, he had none of the unimportant virtues and all the essential ones. The school of hard knocks had given him a tenacious grasp on reality, despite his faith in dreams, omens and superstitions. But it had not toughened him into cynicism or crime, and he had as good a heart as ever any boy had. Here it is written in Dixon Vector 276 about Jim. Okay, so here Huck's attempt to delude Jim into believing he has been dreaming during the fog is modeled on the story of Pike told by William Wright, who was a friend of Twain's. The feud between Shepherd's sons and Granger forts and the shooting of Bags by Colonel Sherburne were similarly modeled on real life incidents. So here is the composition. Huckleberry Finn took 8 years to write. Mark Twain began writing on what he called Huckleberry Finn's autobiography in the summer of 1876, and after 400 pages he liked it only tolerably well. He laid it aside for about 3 years, restarted writing it in the winter of 1879 to 80 and the following summer, and then came back to it in the summer of 1883. Mark Twain wanted to write a boy's book, a sequel of Tom Sawyer. The title of Hawke's book reminds us that he is Tom's comrade, but he also wanted it to be unlike Tom Sawyer by using a first-person narrator. I shall take a boy of 12 and drown him on through life, but not Tom Sawyer. He would not be a good character for it. Clearly, he was planning a book that was generically different from its predecessor, and generically different Huckleberry Finn is from Tom Sawyer. Huckleberry Finn begins in the vein of Tom Sawyer, but the adventures of Tom and Huck continue only for a short while till the third chapter, at the end of which Tom drops off. With the entry of Puff Finn, the narrative takes a sharp turn. Soon Huck and Jim begin their journey to freedom on a raft down the Mississippi. So here you can see the picture. Puff Finn waits in Huck's room to surprise him in chapter 5, Huckleberry Finn. Tom reappears in the last section of the book, but as I shall try to argue later, Tom's reintroduction is meant to be a satiric comment on those who, like Tom, delayed Jim's achievement of freedom for whimsical reasons of their own. Unlike Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn is more than a children's book. It is a comic masterpiece for adults, and a profound novel that explores such universal themes as freedom and bondage, race relations, conscience, greed, and human cruelty. Then time and setting. The novel is set in antebellum America, which means America of the pre-Civil War period, more precisely 40 or 50 years before it was published in 1884. The settings are the riverside town which was Samuel Clemens's boyhood home, Hannibal. Represented in the novel at St. Petersburg, his uncle Squirrel's farm he visited during his holidays, which reappears as Silas Phelps' plantation near Pikesville, and the Mississippi River, on which he was a steamboat pilot as a young man. The book is thus firmly rooted in Sam's early experiences. As he once wrote, I confined myself to the boy life out on the Mississippi because that had a peculiar charm for me, and not because I was not familiar with other aspects of life. So here it is another picture. You can see Mark Twain's last visit to his boyhood home in 1902, courtesy Library of Congress Pictures and Prints Division. Does the book then merely look back at the idyllic period of childhood and young manhood? It doesn't, because during the 1840s the question of slavery was the most important issue in the United States, particularly in the Middle West. His own state, Missouri, was a slave-owning state and figures as such in the novel, and the problem has not been entirely resolved yet. So the novel is not merely nostalgic. It is Janus faced looking back and looking towards the future. Then it is Huckleberry Finn, Mississippi. Since the Mississippi River figures centrally in Huckleberry Finn, a short note on a few physical details about it and Mark Twain's relationship with it would be in order. In your net examination, it could be asked a question: Huckleberry Finn figures in which river? Okay, so you can answer that it is Mississippi. So Mississippi River figures centrally in Huckleberry Finn. A short note on a few physical details about it and Mark Twain's relationship, what it would be in order. So you can see it is the nearby countries and Mississippi River. Map of the area covered in the novel drawn by Charles Dibner, Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, 1943. Everyman's Library, courtesy Elsevier.publishing.co.inc. The river flows through over 12,50,000 square miles and 31 states. It rises in northern Minnesota's Lake Itasca, flows due south about 2350 miles and empties into the Gulf of Mexico below near Orleans, Louisiana. Virtually the entire river is navigable. So here you can remember the Mississippi river's length. The river flows through over 1,250,000 square miles and 31 states. It rises in northern Minnesota's Lake Itasca, flows due south about 2,350 miles and empties into the Gulf of Mexico below New Orleans, Louisiana. Virtually the entire river is navigable. Hannibal, where Sam grew up, is situated on the banks of the Mississippi. He lived there from 1839 to 1853. Except for two short spells, Twain lived on or within sight of the river from the time he was 4 until he was 25. Later he worked in the river towns. In 1875 he became an apprentice steamboat pilot and spent 4 years in the Mississippi itself. In 1861 he revisited the river at least 8 times, though he was never to live on it again. In June 1902, he and a childhood friend, John Briggs, climbed Hannibal's Cardiff Hill and saw the river for the last time. Later, recalling this moment, he said that he was seeing now the most enchanting river view the planet could furnish. I never knew it when I was a boy. It took an educated eye that had travelled on the globe to know and appreciate it. Naturally, the river figures prominently in some of his writing. He wrote a memoir of his apprentice pilot days, serialized in the Atlantic Monthly, which later reappeared in an expanded form as Life on the Mississippi. The river's presence is felt throughout in Tom Sawyer and is even more central to Huckleberry Finn. Though Huck and Jim are on the river abroad, they raft in only about a fifth of its 43 chapters. The river is either mentioned or referred to in almost every chapter. A question to ask while you are reading the novel is, how would you characterize the experiences that Huck and Jim undergo while on the river? Bountiful, terrible, or both? Does it fulfill Jim's quest for freedom or does it hinder it? Then St. Petersburg. The fictional town in this novel, as also in Tom Sawyer, was clearly modeled on Mark Twain's hometown of Hannibal in northeastern Missouri. Find out how many chapters are set in the town. Then Jackson's Island. Fictional uninhabited island on the Mississippi towards the Illinois shore about 3 miles down St. Petersburg. Huck flees to the island to escape his brutal drunken father, and Jim has run away to this place for fear of being sold by his owner, Miss Watson. Inevitably, Huck runs into Jim and they both join forces to begin their journey on a raft down the river. Read chapter 9 for a description of the island. The narrative structure in Huckleberry Finn. So here it is the main point. It is our most awaiting moment. The narrative structure in Huckleberry Finn, it is important in your exam point of view. In university exam, graduation or your post graduation exam, the narrative structure is the main question. It could be asked in the exam. So we will go clearly the narrative structure in Huckleberry Finn. I hope you have been able to read the novel by now. I should like to introduce this section by recalling 2 lines from Scene's Playboy of the Western World. So Scene's Playboy of the Western World, already a dramatic, a British drama you have read in your first year. So I should like to introduce this section by recalling 2 lines from Scene's Playboy of the Western World. Referring to the story of the murder of his father by the runaway Christie, the girl says, "Susan, that's grand story. Honor, he tells it lovely. Do you see which factors are important in a narration or storytelling? Clearly, three factors are important in the process of narration: the teller of the tale, events of the tale, and how the teller presents these events. Okay, the teller of the tale, events of the tale, and how the teller presents these events. A fourth element is the audience. The choice of the events that compose a tale and how they are presented are influenced by a number of considerations, including age, sex, race, social status of both the teller and the audience. Okay, so for a narration or narrative technique, for a narration, what is most important factors? What are the most important factors? Clearly, three factors are responsible for this, or clearly three factors are important in the process of narration: the teller of the tale, the events of the tale, and how the teller presents these events. A fourth element is the audience. The choice of the events that compose a tale and how they are presented are influenced by a number of considerations, including age, sex, race, social status of both the teller and the audience. The conventions governing the narration and the language used in the narration are also important. But before we analyze the narrative, we shall do well to consider the narrative structure of the novel. The novel is episodic in nature. It could be divided into three parts. So here you can memorize the important things. Huckleberry Finn is divided into three parts. Okay, the novel is episodic in nature. So in your NET examination, you might be asked, the Huckleberry Finn has, this novel has dash narrative structure. You can say the answer is episodic. Okay, here it is, the answer is episodic. So what do you mean by episode? As you see in movie serial or in serials in television, you can see one episode comes, then after or another day a new episode comes from the same serial. Okay, so the novel is episodic in structure as like this. So prelude to the journey to escape. Okay, part 1, we will go to part 1, prelude to the journey of escape. The first 11 chapters could be grouped together as they are all set in or near St. Petersburg. It's not often that a character in a literary text takes over as a narrator in another text. This is what happens in Huckleberry Finn. The novel begins in the vein of Tom Sawyer, with Huckleberry Finn introducing himself as the narrator and recounting the events of the earlier book. But Tom is dropped up in chapter 3, and along with him is dropped the romantic element in the form of his attempt to form a gang of robbers. There is a sharp change in the narrative in chapter 4 when Pap Finn, Huck's drunken father, is introduced. Huck, who cannot stand the widow Douglas and her sister Miss Watson's attempts to civilize him, cannot stand the disturbing presence of his father even more. He fakes his own death in cabin where his father has confined him and escapes to Jackson's Island. Separately, Miss Watson's slave Jim too escapes to the island on learning of her plan to sell him down the river for $800. But the fugitives meet on the island, and Huck promises to Jim never to give him away. Okay. So here you can see there is a sharp change in the narrative in chapter 4 when Pap Finn, Huck's drunken father, is introduced. Huck, who cannot stand the widow Douglas and her sister Miss Watson's attempt to civilize him, cannot stand the disturbing presence of his father even more. He fakes his down death in cabin where his father has confined him and escapes to Jackson's Island. Separately, Miss Watson's slave Jim too escapes to the island on learning of her plan to sell him down the river for $800. Both the fugitives meet on the island, and Huck promises to Jim never to give him away. On hearing the people are after Jim, both decide to escape on a raft down the Mississippi in quest of freedom. These 11 chapters help prepare the groundwork for the story of the great escape by Huck and Jim. So here it is part 2, journey on a raft. So loading the loot onto the raft. The next 20 chapters are the central part, concerned with the journey of Huck and Jim down the Mississippi, first by themselves and later in the unwelcome company of two frauds, the king and the duke. The journey is uninterrupted several times with episodes on the shore, in many of which the two frauds take a part. A most important focus in this part is Huck's relationship with Jim, which involves his wrestling with his conscience. First, Huck and Jim run into a wrecked steamboat called Walter's Gut. Huck tries to help its trapped inmates, but without success. Later, both agree not to get mixed up with such adventures. So here you can see a picture leaving the wreck. Huck discovers that Jim does not have a good opinion of royalty. After a storm, he plays a prank on Jim, but apologizes to him later. Because of the fog, Jim's plan to escape to freedom via Cairo and Ohio River go awry. As Huck listens to Jim's joy on his approaching freedom, there is a conflict in his mind, but ultimately he throws in his lot with Jim. Immediately afterwards, he saves Jim from slave hunters by putting them on a false scent. Later, they escape being mown by a steamboat. The adventures on the shore begin with Huck's encounter with the Granger force, who have a long-standing but pointless feud with the Shepherd sons, in which many of them get killed. From chapter 19 onwards, the two frauds take control of the raft. Their adventures include posing as a reformed pirate and printer, doing Shakespeare's plays, and most of all impersonating the English brothers of a local man, Peter Wicks, who has recently died. In this last trick, they almost managed to fool a whole town. From chapter 19 onwards, the two frauds take control of the raft. Their adventures include posing as a reformed pirate and printer, doing Shakespeare's plays, and most of all impersonating the English brothers of a local man, Peter Wicks, who has recently died. In this last trick, they almost managed to fool a whole town. I am the rightful Duke of Bridgewater. Huck discovers that the king has sold Jim for $40 to Silas Phelps. I am a king. His guilt over helping the runaway slave Jim resurfaces, and he writes a letter to Miss Watson, confessing everything, but he finally tears off the letter and is determined to help win back Jim's freedom. 3 points of focus in this part are: Jim's plans to escape to freedom go awry because of the fog, and they move deeper into the slave territory. Huck successfully wrestles with his conscience over being a party to Jim's escape. Huck is an unwilling witness to the spectacle of cruelty, selfishness, and greed during the adventures on shore. Then come to part 3, Freeing of Jim. The last part, consisting of 12 chapters, chapter 32 to chapter 43, is mainly concerned with the Tom's over elaborate plan to free Jim, or what he calls evasion. All action takes place in and around Pixville. Huck goes to Phelps' farm in search of Jim, but is mistaken by Sally Phelps, Tom Sawyer's aunt, for Tom. Guessing that Tom is expected at the farm, Huck makes for the town on the pretext of fetching his luggage and meets Tom on the way. Huck makes for the town on the pretext of fetching his luggage and meets Tom on the way. Huck explains the situation to Tom and goes back to the farm along with his Tom's luggage. When Tom comes, he is received as his brother Sid. Huck tells him of his plan to freeze him, but is both shocked and surprised when the respectable Tom agrees to be a nigger stealer. So when Tom comes, he is received as his brother Sid. Huck tells him of his plan to free Jim, but is both shocked and surprised when the respectable Tom agrees to be a nigger stealer. Huck is unhappy to see the ignominious exit that the two frauds make covered with the tar and feathers. Huck is unhappy to see the ignominious exit that the two frauds make covered with tar and feathers. Tom correctly guessed that Jim is held prisoner in a cabin. Tom correctly guesses that Jim is held prisoner in a cabin. From this point on, Tom takes over in planning and directing an elaborate operation of escape for Jim. In the escape, Tom is injured by a shot in the calf. Leaving Tom in the raft, Huck fetches a kindly old doctor to treat his injury. So in the escape of Tom is injured by a shot in the calf. Leaving Tom in the raft, Huck fetches a kindly old doctor to treat his injury. Tom's disappearance causes considerable worry to Uncle Silas. Soon Tom is brought home by the old doctor and Jim is taken prisoner. The doctor reveals that Jim, instead of running away, nursed Tom back to health. Tom now discloses that Miss Watson had released Jim 2 months back in her will. Knowing that Aunt Sally plans to civilize him, Huck decides to light out for the territory and remain a free person. Okay, so the doctor reveals that Jim, instead of running away, nursed Tom back to health. Tom now discloses that Miss Watson So, in the escape, Tom is injured by a shot in the calf. Leaving Tom in the raft, Huck fetches a kindly old doctor to treat his injury. Tom's disappearance causes considerably worry to Uncle Silas. Soon Tom is brought home by the old doctor and Jim is taken prisoner. The doctor reveals that Jim, instead of running away, nursed Tom back to health. Tom now discloses that Miss Watson had released Jim 2 months back in her will. Knowing that Aunt Sally plans to civilize him, Huck decides to light out for the territory and remain a free person. Does Huckleberry Finn have a unified structure? In what way? I have used the question from the subtitle for 2 reasons. Because in one of the 2 epigraphs to the book, Mark Twain warns the readers not to look for a plot in the novel or else they will be lost. And secondly, because there is a continuing debate about the issue of unity and coherence in the book. Mark Twain has been described as a being temperamentally incapable of sustained concentration required for tight and well-developed plots. According to Bernard D. Voto, he was not a systematic thinker and he did not work on the novel systematically. Okay, according to Bernard D. Voto, he was not a systematic thinker and he did not work on the novel systematically. Here it is the main key point you can note down in your exam point of view. According to Bernard D. Voto, he was not a systematic thinker and he did not work on the novel systematically. It has also been suggested that the freedom of the Picasque form suited his talent ideally, but the episodic structure implicit in the Picasque form notwithstanding, the novel has been credited with possessing internal unity and coherence. In fact, as has been suggested earlier, Mark Twain's use of the modified form of Picasque narrative serves his purpose best, for it allows him to make social criticism through the eyewitness first-person boy narrator and at the same time focus on Huck's moral growth. Apart from thematic unity, the various episodes are held together by the unifying voice of the narrator and his point of view. Apart from the thematic unity, the various episodes are held together by the unifying voice of the narrator and his point of view. The structure, though episodic, is not without a sense of design. The journey on the river, which constitutes the core of the novel, is both preceded and succeeded by events on shore in St. Petersburg and Pikesville respectively. Okay, the structure, though episodic, is not without a sense of design. The journey on the river, which constitutes the core of the novel, is both preceded and succeeded by events on shore in St. Petersburg and Pikesville respectively. The river and the road that moves itself also lends a kind of unity to the structure by controlling the journey and taking Huck and Jim in a particular direction. As T.S. Eliot says, the river will not let them land at Cairo. Where Jean could have reached freedom, it is the river that separates them, and the river that reunites them. Moreover, as Lionel Trilling suggests in his essay, the greatness of Huckleberry Finn, the hero's departure from the river and his return to it, compose a subtle and significant pattern. Okay, so as T.S. Eliot says, the river will not let them land at Cairo, where Jim could have reached freedom. It is the river that separates them, and the river that reunites them. Moreover, as Lionel Trilling suggests in his essay, the greatness of Huckleberry Finn, the hero's departure from the river and his return to it, compose a subtle and significant pattern. The episodes themselves are stitched together by the recurrent pattern of symbolic death and rebirth. The pattern begins with Huck fakes his own death in order to escape his drunken father's control, and continues till the end when he has to find his own identity. Who am I? At the Phelps place, the disclosure that Tom's Aunt Sally has mistaken him for Tom makes Huck feel relieved. It was like being born again. I was so glad to find who I was. Page 252. This pattern of symbolic death and rebirth and the endless yarn spinning that it involves are essentially to Huck's survival and freedom and moral growth. The ending of the novel has been a subject of debate among critics. But since it involves the thematic concern of the novel also, it would be better to discuss the question later in this study material. But I would like you to read the ending and from your own response to it. Keep the following question in mind as you do so. Does the ending represent a falling off? If so, in what way? Distinctive features of the narrative. Picasso's form. The structure of Huckleberry Finn is firmly rooted in the tradition of the simple linear form of Picasso's narrative, which goes back to Pertinius Satiricon. In the nature of narrative, Scholes and Kellogg say, in Picasso's narrative, a rogue tells the story of his own experiences in the contemporary world, usually involving his travels from place to place through a wide spectrum of society. The main interests of Picasso's fiction are socially and satirical. The pattern Mark Twain has modified to suit his artistic purpose. His central character narrator is of course not a rogue and is not a road journey by a journey down the Mississippi. On the contrary, he is a poor white boy who, living on the fringe of respectable society, serves as a moral touchstone in the course of his journey, and whose lengthiest encounter in the novel is with a pair of rogues among others. Scholes and Kellogg suggest that the Picasso's narrative could be turned outward to expose the weakness of the society, or it could be turned inward, in which case it became a confession and recorded. The moral regeneration of the narrator Huckleberry Finn is remarkable because it blends both. It is a severe indictment of the corruption, moral decay, and intellectual impoverishment of the society to which Huck is a witness. But it is also an unpretentious account of his moral growth with his relations with Jim. Okay. So it is a Picasso's novel, Picasso's Satiricon, or Picasso's social and satirical fiction. Okay, the first person eyewitness boy narrator. The narrative in Huckleberry Finn, the first person narrative of the first person eyewitness boy narrator. The narrative in Huckleberry Finn is based on realism and truth. Mark Twain achieves his effect principally by using a first person eyewitness boy narrator. This device ensures greater reliability. The fact that boy narrator is a character living on the periphery of society without any respectable ambitions of his own, together with his moral sensitivity, makes his narrative more objective and more truthful. The fact that the boy narrator is a character living on the periphery of the society, without any respectable ambitions of his own, together with his moral sensitivity, makes its narrative more objective and more truthful. In the first paragraph of the novel itself, Huck, the narrator, separates himself from the author of the Tom Sawyer, who at times tempered with truth. You do not know about me. Without you have read a book by the name of the name of the adventure of Tom Sawyer, but that are not matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There were things which he stressed, but mainly he told the truth. By distancing himself from Mark Twain, Huck is making space for himself as a truthful teller of his story. The spoken idiom of the narrative. The opening paragraph also identifies a key feature of the narrative, namely the spoken idiom used in it. The oral quality of Huck's written narrative sets apart from some other first-person narratives. The Huck is composing a book and he is aware of it. If wouldn't note that a trouble it was to make a book, I wouldn't tackle it, and I'm not going to no more. He adopts the style of a person speaking to other persons. The use of the vernacular idiom, which has own extravagant praise from Hemingway and others, will be discussed in a later unit. But it is important to note that Huck as a narrator shows an awareness of the presence of an audience or reader. Evidence of this, which is widespread in the narrative, includes the use of pronoun you. Moreover, Huck's language has a recognizable oral quality marked by the frequent use of run-on sentences with the help of and then and so on. By what Walter Ong in his book Orality and Literacy 1982 calls the additive oral style. The widow, she cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb and called me a lot of other names too, but she never meant no harm by it. She put me in them new clothes again, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Well then, the old thing commenced again. The widow rung a bell for supper and you had to come to time. Page 11. The conversational idiom used here helps in producing the intended effect of the simplicity and innocence and naivete, which is in sharp contrast to the inflated language of the tricksters in the novel. The spoken idiom used by Huck to narrate also makes the transition to dramatic presentation easier. Mark Twain sustains the tone of the spoken idiom almost throughout the novel, which closes the Huck Finn, signing off as yours truly in the manner of a letter to the reader. Apart from signifying the narrator's awareness of the audience or reader's presence, this direct address and more especially the spoken idiom help to make the discourse more intimate and more credible. So in this narrative technique, you have main key points. The Mark Twain's used more idioms, that is vernacular idioms. You can see, apart from signifying the narrator's awareness of the audience reader's presence, this direct address and more specifically especially the spoken idiom help to make the discourse more intimate and more credible. Okay, here it is the main key point. A similar use of pronoun you can be found in the chapter 18, where Huck is describing Colonel Grangerford. His hands was long and thin, and every day of his life he put on a clean shirt and full suit from head to foot, made out of linen, so white it hurt your eyes to look at it. He was as kind as he could be. You could feel that, you know, and so you had confidence. He sustains the tone of the spoken word throughout the novel, which closes with Huck Finn's signing off as yours truly in the manner of a letter to the reader. So the final page of the manuscript of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, here it is the picture, 787, courtesy the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, Buffalo, New York. I want to keep track of any other evidence of the narrator's awareness of the readers. Then density of narration. Huck's narration is circumstantial, dense with details. Here is a sample from Huck's description of how he faked his own death. Now I thought of something else, so I went and got the bag of meal and my old saw out of the canoe and fetched them to the house. I took the bag to where it used to stand and rived a hole in the bottom of it with a saw, for there were not no knives and forks on the place. Tapped on everything with his clasp knife about the cooking. Then I carried the sack about 100 yards across the grass and through the willows east of the house, so to shallow lake that was 5 miles wide and full of rushes and dogs too, you might say, in the season. That is italics added 7:47. The circumstantiality of the narrator, including details of the different kinds, attests to the power of observation of the eyewitness and inspires the reader's confidence. Huck puts this skill to good use while faking stories to lull suspicion and put people on the wrong scent. With the king and duke ask Huck about Jim, he tells them a soft story about the death of everyone in the family except Pa and my brother like Ick, and how Pa went to live with Uncle Ben, who got a little one horse place 44-mile below Orleans. But while narrative density is used by Huck to survive in a world full of violence and fraud, the Duke and the King have the same skill to deceive and cheat others. Then modes of presentation. A careful study of the narrative reveals that Huck the narrator is telling his story sometime after the events have happened, though how much time has elapsed it is difficult to say. Since Huck is the original experiencer of those events, it is possible to distinguish between Huck the protagonist and Huck the narrator. Much of the narrative strategy depends on how the author handles the chronological gap. At times the narrator self-consciously refers to this narration. In chapter 7, for instance, he talks to the readers about the inadequacy of his language to describe a scene. You know what I mean? I don't know the words to put it in. Page 48. In chapter 18, he refers to the need to trim his narrative. I don't want to talk much about the next day. I reckon I will cut it pretty short. Such occasions are, however, few and far between. Principally, the narrator either proceeds with the narrative of the past but bobbing up at regular intervals with reflections and comments in the present, or reports the events verbatim, withholding his identity completely. A combination of both these modes helps Mark Twain to break monotony and sustain interest, at the same time ensuring greater realism and credibility. A combination of both these modes helps Mark Twain to break monotony and sustain interest, at the same time ensuring greater realism and credibility. The first mode could be illustrated by the following excerpt. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke and asked the widow to let me, but she wouldn't. She said it was a mean practice and wasn't clean, and I must try to not do it anymore. That is just the way with some people. They get down on a thing when they don't know nothing about it. Here she was bothering about Moses, which was no kin to her and no use to anybody. The unself-consciousness care with which the narrative moves between the past and present and back into the past helps keep it flowing. Notice also that narrator's reflections or comments are brief, which also contributes to keeping the narrative unclogged. Here is a slightly longer piece of reflection when Huck gets separated from Jim in the fog. I kept quiet, with my ears cocked, about 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you are lying dead still on the water, and if a little glimpse of snag slips by, you don't think to yourself how fast you are going, but you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's steering along. If you think it aren't dismal and lonesome out in fog that way by yourself in the night you try to find it once, you will see. Huck uses the present tense as narrator not only to reflect to a remark or comment, but also to indicate his intense involvement while describing past events. This is clear from the 2 sentences immediately following the excerpt quoted above. Next, for about a half an hour, I hooves now and then. At last I hear the answer a long ways off and tries to follow it, but I couldn't do it, and directly I judged. Huck's use of historical present is in fact habitual and helps cut down the distance between the narrative and readers and increase the dramatic quality of it. This brings us to the second mode, or what we could call the dramatic mode of the presentation, in which Huck's experiences come through to us directly without having passed through his consciousness. Huck's meeting with George Thatcher in chapter 4 is an example. His meeting with Jim on Jackson's Island is even more to the point. Here is part of the narration. By and Jim says, "But looky here, Huck, who's it that was killed in that shanty? If it weren't you?" Then I told him that the whole thing, and he said it was smart. She said Tom Sawyer couldn't get up no better plan than what I had. Then I says, "How do you come to be here, Jim? And how would you get here?" He looked pretty uneasy and didn't say nothing for a minute. Then he says, "Maybe I better not tell." "Why, Jim?" "Well, there's reasons." "But you wouldn't tell on me if I used to tell you, would you, Huck?" "Blamed if I would, Jim." "Well, I believe you, Huck." I run off. "Jim, but mind, you said you wouldn't tell." "You know, you said you wouldn't tell, Huck." "Well, I did. I said I wouldn't, and I will stick to it. Honest Injun, I will. People would call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make no difference. I ain't going to tell, and I ain't going back there anyway. So now, let's know all about it." Such passages are of course not meant to be read in isolation, but they unmistakably hit their target. The absence of narrative commentary enables the spontaneity of Huck's promise not to betray Jim, as also Jim's trusting nature, to come through to the readers at first and with full force. And both these perceptions are crucial to the meaning of the novel. Critics have pointed out some difficulties with the narrative. First, in two cases, Huck, the retrospective narrator, keeps back the knowledge that he now has, presents the events with the limited knowledge that he as a participant had at the time. In chapter 9, Jim discovers from looking into the floating house that Pap Finn is dead, but withholds the information till near the end when he breaks the news to Huck. Page 328. Also, the information that Miss Watson had freed Jim in her will is kept back by Tom when Huck meets in chapter 33. Again, Huck, the narrator, who now has the information, connives at Tom's silence. Of this, the second piece of knowledge is more crucial, but I feel that this silence on the part of the narrator could be looked at as part of his presentational strategy. If Huck had disclosed the information that Jim had already been freed, it would have diluted the presentation of the intensity of Huck's moral struggle involved in first writing the letter to Miss Watson and then tearing it off. So, if Huck, the narrator, withholds the vital piece of information, it is entirely to make the presentation of events rhetorically effective and aesthetically satisfying. So, if Huck, the narrator, withholds the vital piece of information, it is entirely to make the presentation of events rhetorically effective and aesthetically satisfying. These two examples also highlight the essential ambiguity of truth and fiction at the heart of the text. Narrative irony. Mark Twain's use of an adolescent who has the innocence of a boy and who doesn't always understand his experience completely serves the author's satiric purpose admirably. The writer's use of irony deserves notice here. Irony is always the result of a disparity of understanding. In any situation in which one person knows or perceives more or less than other, irony must be either actually or potentially present. In any example of narrative art, there are broadly speaking three points of view: those of the characters, the narrator, and the audience. A narrative becomes more sophisticated. A fourth point of view is added by the development of a clear distinction between the narrator and the author. Narrative irony is a function of disparity among these three or four viewpoints, and narrative artists have always been ready to employ this disparity to make effects of various kinds. The nature of the narrative, that is page number 240. In the case of the Huckleberry Finn, the irony resulting from the disparity of understanding between the author and the boy narrator makes Mark Twain's satire far more effective than it would have been if he had made his comments directly. Paragraph 3 of chapter 1 offers an example. The widow rang a bell for supper and you had to come to time. When you got to the table, you could not go right to eating, but you had to wait for the widow to tuck down her head and grumble a little over the victuals though there wasn't really anything the matter with them. Emphasis added. The widow takes Huck to church. Twain's comment on the pities of women like Widow Douglas and Miss Watson made through Huck the narrator would lose half their force if he had made them directly. What Huck does here is to defamiliarize the practice of saying grace and look at it afresh. An even better example of the narrative irony in the service of satire in Huck's reaction to Jim's talk of being free as they are wrapped neared Cairo. It most froze me to hear such talk. He wouldn't ever dare to tuck such talk in his life before. Just see what a difference it made in him minute he judged he was about free. It was according to the old saying, give a nigger an inch and he will take an L. Here was this nigger which I had as good as helped run away, coming right out flat footed and saying he would steal his children that belonged to a man I didn't even know, a man that hadn't ever done me no harm. The disparity between the traditional viewpoint voiced by the essentially naive Huck and the humanistic viewpoint of the author implied here makes a damning comment on the racist society that poisons even young minds. This narrative irony contributes a great deal to the pleasure we derive from reading narrative literature. Popular elements in the narrative. One of the several factors that account for the continuing popularity of Huckleberry Finn is the presence of folk motifs in the novel. A major motif in the quest motif, the death and rebirth is another, and this could be traced in the novel with the help of the categories of characters suggested by B. Prof in the morphology of folktale. The categories of characters suggested by B. Prof in the morphology of folktale. Prof believes that a folktale has 7 characters, each of whom embodies the function of role, villain, donor, helper, the suit for person, dispatcher, hero, and false hero. Though not all of these character types can be spotted in the novel, one could find close approximations of hero and false hero in Huck and Tom respectively. If the quest in the novel is for freedom, then Huck could be called a hero or an anti-hero who is also a helper because he tries to secure freedom for Jim. On the other hand, Tom is the false hero because he arrogates to himself the heroic role of Jim's emancipator and in the process puts him to avoidable torture and indignity. As for villain, several characters seem to fit the role. Miss Watson, whose plan to sell Jim alarms him and induces him to run away, and Puffin and the king and the duke. Here it is. Now Jim, you are a free man. Here it is a picture you can see. Now Jim, you are a free man. The other major motif is the motif of rebirth that runs almost through the length of the narrative. These underlying threads help to unify the narration internally. Another popular element which Twain was familiar with, which he incorporated in the narrative, is the tall tale, tricks and yarns. A tall tale is a fictional story which is told in the form of personal narrative or anecdote which challenges the listener's credulity with comic outlandishness. A tall tale is a fictional story which is told in the form of personal narrative or anecdote which challenges the listener's credulity with comic outlandishness. A tall tale is a fictional story which is told in the form of personal narrative or anecdote. A tall tale is a fictional story which is told in the form of personal narrative or anecdote which challenges the listener's credulity with comic outlandishness. The two clear examples of tall tales are the tales told by the so-called king and the duke to each other in the presence of Huck and Jim. These tales are principally meant to impress them both, and they certainly succeed in inducing them to agree to wait upon the royalty, but they also ironically succeed in exposing them to be frauds to Huck. In contrast to their wicked tricks and yarn spinning is the innocent yarn spinning of Huck, who was to invent yarns on the spur of the moment for the purpose of survival throughout the book. In contrast to their wicked tricks and yarn spinning is the innocent yarn spinning of Huck, who was to invent yarns on the spur of the moment for the purpose of survival throughout the book. Then let us sum up. As we have seen, the narrative puts a premium on truth and realism. Tom's book derived romanticism stands rejected. By the time we reach chapter 31, the entire trajectory of the narrative prepares us to expect the final steps towards securing Jim's freedom. By the ending of the novel, with Tom's over-elaborate romantic plan to free the already free Jim comes as a big setback. Jim's story doesn't end as we expect it to. Is this a defect in the novel? If the story had ended as expected, wouldn't have been a fairy tale ending? Seen in the context of the status of African Americans in America, isn't the present ending a truer, more realistic ending? So here is the glossary. You can read. Here is the narrative. A working definition of narrative is given by Oxford English Encyclopedia Dictionary as a spoken or written account of connected events in order of happening. Events are indispensable to a narrative. Picaresque novel, a novel that gives a first person account of the novels of a character, originally a picara or rogue. Evasion, a corruption of the French word evasion or escape. Tom uses it in order to describe the escapes of a prisoner. When a prisoner of style escapes, it's called an evasion. It's always called. So when a king escapes, for instance, Huckleberry Finn, this term is also used in the last chapter. Here is the question. Point out the narrative irony in the following passage. Once I said to myself that goes to everlasting fire. Hint. What is Huck's intention in these reflections? What does the passage achieve at the end? What is the target of criticism in it? Analyze the following passage pointing at the narrative strategy employed in its different parts, chapter 25 to page number 189. Then one of them turns loose and goes to crying fit to burst. Pick out passages where Huck the narrator speaks to the readers directly. Make a list of events presented dramatically without comment by the narrator. Here it is further reading. This is Vector Dixon, Sam Clemens of Hannibal, Boston 1952. Keeler, Jonathan, Literary Theory, Oxford, Scholes, Robert and Robert Kellogg, The Nature of Narrative, Basic Book for the Study Narratives in General. Twin Mark and the annotated Huckleberry Finn with an introduction, notes and bibliography by Michael Patrick Hunn, that is newer. So here it is all about the narrative techniques or structure of Huckleberry Finn. Okay, so viewers, kindly subscribe, share and like my videos, that is the study with master notes, and push the bell icon to get the earliest notification of it. It will help in your exam and also your competitive exam. So thank you viewers.